My name is Eleanor. I'm 60 years old, and I always believed that family was a sacred bond, unbreakable. That is, until the day my son, David, raised his hand against me, not once or twice, but 15 times. Each blow echoed in the silence of the room, punctuated by the cruel laughter of his wife, Sarah. What they didn't know was that the very house where they humiliated me was still legally in my name. My revenge wouldn't be loud or dramatic, but a silent, decisive act delivered through the cold finality of legal documents. But before I continue, make sure you're subscribed to Grandma's True Moments and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. We love to know how far our stories reach. I can still feel the sting of that night as if it were yesterday. It was a typical Sunday, the kind meant for family gatherings. I had prepared David's favorite shepherd's pie, the one with extra cheesy topping he'd adored since childhood. Despite him being 38 and having a hardened expression lately, I still saw my little boy. Sarah arrived first, her overly sweet perfume announcing her presence. She offered that familiar, insincere smile that never quite reached her eyes and placed a bottle of cheap wine on the table. For my dearest mother-in-law, she'd chirped, fully aware I couldn't drink due to my blood pressure. I thanked her anyway, as I always did, striving for peace. David arrived half an hour later, already agitated. I could tell by the way he tossed his keys onto the counter and his clipped greeting. Something at work must have gone wrong, I thought, but I didn't ask. I knew all too well his temper when contradicted. We sat at the table, and I served the meal in silence. It was then that I mentioned, without much thought, that the kitchen faucet had a persistent drip. The faucet in my house, you mean? He retorted, emphasizing the word as if to remind me I lived there out of his benevolence. But the truth was far different. This house had been purchased with the funds from the sale of my apartment, where I'd lived for 30 years after my husband passed. At the time, David had insisted it would be better for tax purposes to put everything in his name. Trusting him completely, I'd signed the transfer, but I'd kept the original deed, the true legal document, safely in my possession. It's just a faucet, dear, I said softly. That's when he slammed his fist on the table, making the silverware jump. You think you're so clever, don't you? You think you can tell me what to do in my own home? Sarah subtly smirked behind her napkin, her eyes glinting with that morbid satisfaction she always displayed when tension arose between David and me. Have you forgotten I took you in when no one else would? He continued, rising from his chair. Have you forgotten you could be in a nursing home right now? I remained silent, my gaze fixed on my untouched plate. The shepherd's pie, prepared with such love, now seemed like a heavy, tasteless lump. Look at me when I'm talking to you. He roared, grabbing my chin forcefully to lift my face. That's when it happened. The first blow came as a shock, not so much from the pain, but from the sheer disbelief. Never in his life had my son laid a hand on me. My cheek stung, and tears welled in my eyes. Sarah let out a theatrical gasp, covering her mouth with her hand, but her eyes were smiling. She was enjoying the spectacle. Double quotes David. Please, I whispered. The second slap was harder, then the third and the fourth. I lost count after the 10th. My ears were ringing, and my entire face was on fire. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I sat there, rigid, as my own son unleashed his fury upon me. When he finally stopped, he was panting. I looked at him, no longer recognizing the man before me. Where was the boy who used to hold my hand to cross the street? Where was the teenager who brought me dandelions on Mother's Day? This is so you learn to respect who's in charge here, he sneered, adjusting his shirt as if he'd just closed an important business deal. Sarah was now openly smiling, no longer bothering to hide her delight. I rose in silence, leaving my plate untouched, and walked slowly to my bedroom at the back of the house. I closed the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and finally let the tears fall. But they weren't tears of pain or fear. They were tears of a decision solidifying in my heart, cold and unyielding like ice on a winter night. As I gently touched my swollen face, I remembered the dresser drawer where I kept the original deed to the house, the document that legally proved this place was still mine. David had persuaded me to transfer the property into his name, but we never completed the legal process with the registry office. He only held a private contract, which held no real legal weight. That night, as I listened to their laughter echoing from the living room as if nothing had happened, I retrieved the deed and placed it in a folder. In the morning, when they left for work, I would visit my old friend Arthur, a retired lawyer who still had excellent contacts in the legal field. I went to bed fully clothed, unable to sleep soundly. The hours dragged on as I meticulously planned every step. This wouldn't be a noisy or violent revenge. It would be silent and definitive, like the eyes that now occupied the place where maternal love once resided. When the sun rose, I heard David's footsteps in the hallway, then the shower, and finally the front door slamming shut. Sarah left right after, the click of her heels fading into the empty house. I waited another half hour to ensure they wouldn't return for anything forgotten. I placed the folder with the documents in my purse, put on my warmest coat, the one David called a rag, and slipped out the back door. The day was overcast and cold, as if the weather conspired with my mood. I walked 3 blocks to Arthur's house. He opened the door, still in his pajamas, but his expression immediately changed when he saw my swollen face. "Eleanor, my goodness, what happened to you?" "I need your help, Arthur," I said simply, stepping inside as he made way for me. "I need to sell a house." Arthur poured me a coffee as he examined the documents I had brought. His eyes moved from the paper to my bruised face, connecting the dots without me needing to explain every detail. He was a perceptive man and had known my late husband well. "The deed is in your name," he confirmed, adjusting his glasses. "David never registered the transfer with the land registry. Legally, the house is still yours, Eleanor." A cold relief washed over me. "So, I can sell it?" "Yes, you can," Arthur replied, placing the cup on the table. "But are you certain about this? He's your son, after all." I lightly touched my swollen cheek. A son who did this in my own house, in front of his wife, who laughed at me. "I'm certain, Arthur," he nodded gravely. "I know a couple looking for a house in that area. They can pay with cash and close the deal quickly if that's what you want." "It's exactly what I want," I replied. "I want everything done while they're at work. I want David to come home today and find strangers living there." Arthur hesitated. "Eleanor, it's just Arthur. I'm not asking for anything more than what rightfully belongs to me." He didn't argue further. Instead, he picked up the phone and began making calls. First to the interested couple, then to a notary friend, then to a moving company. As I watched him organize everything, I felt a sense of lightness for the first time in years. Before noon, I was signing the sale papers at a notary's office in the city centre. The buyer couple, the Pattersons, seemed kind and excited about the sudden purchase. They didn't inquire about the strange circumstances, perhaps because the significant discount on the price was too attractive to ask questions. "You can move in today," I said as I handed them the keys. "The house is furnished, but you can do whatever you want with the furniture." "I don't want anything from that place." Mrs. Patterson took my hands in hers. "Thank you for selling us your house. We've always dreamed of living in this neighborhood." I didn't have the heart to tell her that this place was no longer a dream for me, but a nightmare. I just smiled and wished them happiness. Arthur walked with me to the bank to deposit the money from the sale. "What are you going to do now, Eleanor? Where will you live?" "I have a friend in a neighboring state who always offered me a room. I'll stay with her for a while until I decide what to do with the money. Perhaps I'll buy a small apartment for myself." In reality, I already knew exactly what I would do. Part of the money would be donated to an institution that housed women who were victims of domestic violence. The rest would buy a small cottage outside a quiet town, where I could finally have the peace I so deserved after decades of caring for others. As we walked, Arthur suddenly stopped. "Eleanor, aren't you going to retrieve your personal things, clothes, documents, photos?" I shook my head. "I already took what was essential last night. The rest are just things. I can buy others." The truth was, I wanted nothing that reminded me of that life. Not even the photos of David as a boy. The boy who smiled in those photographs had died a long time ago, replaced by the man who raised a hand against his own mother. By noon, the moving trucks were already at the house, loading the Pattersons' furniture. Arthur had explained the situation to them, requesting discretion. They agreed to finish the move before 6 p.m., the time David usually returned from work. I didn't go there to watch. I didn't want to see that house ever again. Instead, I took a taxi to the bus terminal and bought a ticket to a small town in a neighboring state. While waiting for the bus, I sent a message to my friend Martha, letting her know I was on my way. "Did something happen, Eleanor?" She replied almost immediately. "I'll tell you when I get there," I typed. But yes, a lot happened. As I sat on the waiting bench, I imagined David coming home, putting his key in the lock only to find it no longer worked. I visualized his face as he found strangers in his living room, the panic in his eyes as he realized he no longer had a place to call his own. Should I feel guilty? Perhaps. But every time that guilt threatened to surface, I touched my face, still sore, and remembered Sarah's laughter. No, there was no room for guilt, only for the cold justice I had served. The bus arrived, and I boarded with only a small suitcase containing a few changes of clothes and the now cancelled deed to the Hoe. Use. When the engine started and we began to pull away from the city, I felt as if an enormous weight had been lifted from my shoulders. My phone started ringing incessantly 2 hours later. David, Sarah. David again. I could imagine the chaos they were experiencing. I turned off the phone and looked out the window, watching the landscape gradually change from urban to rural. Martha was waiting for me at the terminal with a tight hug. Seeing my face, she gasped, "My God, Eleanor, who did this to you?" "My son," I replied simply, finally allowing myself to cry in the arms of my friend of decades. "But it's over now." She took me to her cozy house on the outskirts of the small city, with a view of the mountains that seemed to embrace the horizon. We sat on her balcony with cups of hot tea while I recounted everything that had happened. "You sold the house while they were at work?" Martha asked, incredulous. I nodded. "The house was mine. It always was." "David just believed it was his." Martha shook her head, impressed. "And now, what are you going to do?" I looked at the mountains in the distance, feeling a peace I hadn't experienced in years. "I'm going to start over, Martha. At 60 years old, I'm going to start over." That night, I briefly turned on my phone to check my bank account and found dozens of messages and missed calls. Most were from David, alternating between desperate pleas and furious accusations. Some were from Sarah, accusing me of having ruined their lives. There were also messages from unknown numbers, probably lawyers they had hastily hired. One message, in particular, caught my attention. It was from Arthur. "It's done, Eleanor. The Pattersons are already settled and changed the locks." David showed up screaming, but they called the police. "Everything is legally protected. Rest in peace." It wasn't a rest in peace of death, but of life, a new life that I would build from the ashes of the old one. I turned off the phone again and looked at the stars that dotted the night sky. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe completely. The mountain air filled my lungs like a promise of freedom. The first few days at Martha's house were strange. I would wake up startled in the middle of the night, confused about where I was, my heart racing as I relived the events. Sometimes I would instinctively touch my face, as if I could still feel the phantom mark of David's blows. The swelling had gone down, but the memory was as vivid as an open wound. Martha noticed my unease. One morning, as we were drinking coffee on the balcony, she took my hand. "You did what you had to do, Eleanor. Don't carry guilt for it." "It's not guilt," I replied, watching a hummingbird flit among the flowers in the garden. "It's strangeness. For 38 years, I was David's mother. I built my life around that. And now you're just Eleanor," Martha completed with a kind smile. Eleanor who can do whatever she wants without answering to anyone. There was a terrifying freedom in those words. Who was Eleanor without the role of a sacrificial mother? Who was I apart from the woman who had dedicated her life to an ungrateful son? In the second week, I decided to turn on my phone to check my bank account. The money from the house sale was already available, a considerable amount that would provide comfort for years to come. There were more messages from David, but the tone had changed. Now he was pleading, saying it had been a mistake, that he was sorry that Sarah had left him. The last messages were almost incoherent, mixing rage and despair. One of them made me pause. "I'm sleeping in my car, Mom. I have nowhere to go. Please forgive me." I felt a pang in my chest, that maternal instinct that never completely disappears. For a moment, my fingers hovered over the keyboard, about to reply. But then I remembered Sarah's laughter, the sound of his hand against my face, the humiliation I felt sitting at that table while they reveled in my pain. I turned off the phone without replying. The next day, we visited a local real estate office. There was a small cottage for sale nearby. Nothing too grand, just a half-acre lot with a modest house, some fruit trees, and a stream that ran across the back of the property. It was perfect. "Are you sure?" Martha asked when I expressed immediate interest. "Don't you want to think about it a little more?" "I've been thinking about this for years without knowing it," I replied with a certainty that surprised me. "I always wanted a place like this, just mine, where I could plant my own vegetables and wake up to the birds singing." We made the offer the same day. The owner, an elderly gentleman who was moving to live with his daughter in the city, accepted promptly. In 1 week, I would be the owner of my own piece of land. While we waited for the paperwork to be finalized, I started buying the basics for my new life: simple clothes, some kitchen utensils. Seeds to plant. Martha accompanied me on the shopping trips, her enthusiasm almost as great as mine. "You're different," she commented as we were choosing gardening tools. More alive, it was true. The hunched and silent woman who had lived in David's house, always trying to occupy the minimum possible space, was disappearing. In her place, someone who had forgotten how to exist was emerging. The Eleanor who made plans, who smiled without fear, who chose for herself. 2 days before moving to the cottage, a strange car stopped in front of Martha's house. My heart froze when I saw David get out of the vehicle. He was disheveled, with a scruffy beard and deep dark circles under his eyes. He looked like he had aged years in just a few weeks. "How did he find us?" I whispered to Martha, who was beside me at the window. "He must have called all your friends until he found out," she replied, squeezing my arm in solidarity. "Do you want me to send him away?" I took a deep breath, feeling the initial fear give way to a cold calm. "No, I'm going to talk to him." Martha looked at me, surprised. "Are you sure? After what he did?" "Exactly. Because of that," I replied. "I need to close this chapter once and for all." I walked out to the balcony as David approached slowly, like a wounded animal. When he saw me, he stopped, unsure. His eyes scanned my face, where the last vestiges of the bruises were still visible. "Mom," he began, his voice choked. I raised my hand, interrupting him. "Don't call me that. You lost that right that night." He swallowed, his eyes filling with tears. "Please let me explain. I was drunk. I had problems at work. Sarah was pressuring me 15 times, I said simply. "You hit me 15 times while your wife laughed." "There's no explanation for that, David." He fell to his knees on the stone path, sobbing. Now I lost everything, Mom. Sarah left me. I'm sleeping in my car. My friends aren't answering my calls. Nobody wants to help me. I watched him there, broken the son I had raised, whom I had rocked in my arms when he had a fever, for whom I had sewn superhero costumes, whom I had taught to ride a bicycle. Now reduced to a broken man, begging not for forgiveness, but for convenience. What do you want, David? I asked, my voice softer now, but no less firm. I want to go back, he sobbed. I want my life back. Please tell the new owners it was a mistake, that you couldn't sell the house, and there it was. It wasn't true repentance. It was just desperation to get back his lost comfort. Not once did he mention my pain, my humiliation. Everything came down to what he had lost. I can't do that, I replied calmly. And even if I could, I wouldn't. The house is gone, David. Your old life is gone. He lifted his face, contorted by crying. What am I going to do? Where am I going to live? You're 38 years old. You have a job and your health. You're going to do what many people do, start over. Rent a small place, save, rebuild, alone. He asked, his voice almost childlike. Yes, alone. Just like I'm doing at 60, David slowly got up, wiping his face with his sleeve. Something changed in his expression, the plea giving way to a contained rage. You have no heart. A real mother would never do this to her own son. That might have hurt me weeks ago, but now it just confirmed that I had made the right decision. A real son would never do what you did. Goodbye, David. I turned to go inside, but his words stopped me. This isn't over. I'm going to sue you. I'm going to prove that you were sick when you signed those papers. I'm going to get back what's mine. I looked at him over my shoulder, feeling only a deep sadness. The house was never yours, David. That was your mistake from the beginning. I went inside and closed the door, listening to his screams turn into increasingly desperate threats. Martha hugged me in silence as we listened to the car pull away with a rough start, tires squealing on the asphalt. Are you okay? She asked after a while. Surprisingly, I was. The encounter I had feared so much had happened, and instead of breaking me, it had confirmed my strength. David wasn't sorry for what he had done. He was just desperate for what he had lost. I'm better than I imagined, I replied honestly. That night, I got a call from Arthur. Eleanor, David came to see me. He's threatening to file a lawsuit. It's no use, is it? I asked, feeling a slight tremor of worry. Absolutely none, Arthur guaranteed. The house was legally in your name. You were in full possession of your mental faculties when you sold it, and we have witnesses to the assault if necessary. He's just bluffing out of desperation. Thanks, Arthur, for everything. Just be careful, Eleanor. Desperate people can do unthinkable things. After the call, I thought about Arthur's words. David was hurt and humiliated. A dangerous combination for someone who had already shown a capacity for violence. But I wouldn't live in fear. Not anymore. The move to the cottage happened on a sunny Thursday morning. The place was even more beautiful than I remembered. The small but cozy house, the sloping land that descended gently to the stream. The fruit trees laden with blossoms that promised abundance in the coming months. Martha insisted on spending the first few days with me, helping to organize the few pieces of furniture I had bought and planting the first seeds in the vegetable garden we improvised. At night, we sat on the balcony in newly purchased rocking chairs, drinking chamomile tea and watching the fireflies dancing among the trees. It's strange, I commented on the third night. I spent so much of my life taking care of others that now I almost feel guilty for only taking care of myself. Martha smiled. You deserve it, Eleanor. You always deserved it. The day Martha went back home, I felt a knot in my chest. Was I really ready to live alone, far from everything and everyone? The cottage was a 20-minute drive from the nearest town, and I still didn't have my own vehicle. I'll be a phone call away, Martha guaranteed as she said goodbye. and I'll come to visit whenever I can. Besides, you'll meet the neighbors soon. They're good people around here. When her car disappeared down the dirt road, I sat on the balcony and observed my small kingdom. The loneliness I feared didn't come. Instead, I felt a deep peace, as if I had finally found my place in the world. In the following weeks, I established a simple routine. I would wake up at sunrise, make a strong coffee, and go take care of the vegetable garden before the heat of the day intensified. The first seedlings were already beginning to appear: lettuce, carrots, tomatoes, herbs. Seeing these little lives growing under my care brought me a satisfaction I had never experienced before. Afterward, I would spend a few hours exploring the land, discovering its secrets. I found an old apple tree hidden among other trees, a small stone bench near the stream that the previous owner must have built, and even a hummingbird nest in a flowering bush near the kitchen window. In the afternoons, I read the books I had always wanted to read but never had time for: novels, biographies, books on gardening and cooking. Or I would just sit on the balcony with my notebook, writing thoughts, memories, plans for the future. It was like rediscovering a version of myself that had been silenced for decades. The closest neighbors, the Millers, came to introduce themselves after a week. They were a retired couple who grew lavender on a larger farm a mile away. They brought homemade bread and a jar of plum jam as a welcome gift. "If you need anything, just holler," Mr. Miller said with a kind smile. "Out here, we look out for each other." His wife invited me to a Sunday lunch where I met other neighbors from the area, simple, genuine people who welcomed me without asking questions about my past. It was refreshing to just be Ms. Eleanor from the new cottage instead of David's mom or the lady who was assaulted by her son. One afternoon, as I was picking some herbs for dinner, I heard the sound of a car approaching. My heart instantly raced. Could it be David? Had he found my address? I dropped the basket of herbs and ran inside the house, peeking nervously through the window. It was just the mail carrier delivering a package Martha had sent, flower seeds we couldn't find in the area. I breathed a sigh of relief, but I realized that the fear was still there, hidden beneath the surface of my new life. That night, sitting on the balcony with a cup of tea, I reflected on that fear. I had rebuilt my life, found peace, and even a new community that welcomed me. But I was still scared by the sound of an unfamiliar car. Did David still have that power over me? I decided I wouldn't allow that. The next morning, I called Arthur. "I need to know how he is," I said bluntly. Not out of maternal concern, but for my own peace of mind. Arthur was silent for a moment. He dropped the lawsuit, Eleanor. He consulted some lawyers, and they all said the same thing: it was a lost cause. From what I know, he rented a small apartment in a suburb and is trying to get his life together. And Sarah, she went back to her parents in the city. From what I heard, it seems the marriage was already on its last leg before this incident. The loss of the house was just the final push. I absorbed that information in silence. David was moving on, rebuilding his life just as I had told him he would. For some reason, this brought me relief, not because I was worried about his well-being, but because it meant he had less reason to try and find me. "Thanks, Arthur. That's what I needed to know, Eleanor," he said before I hung up. "Are you happy there?" The question caught me by surprise. Happy? It was a word I hadn't used in so long that I had almost forgotten its meaning. "I'm at peace," I replied finally. And I think for me, that is happiness. As the months passed, my small cottage flourished. The vegetable garden already produced enough vegetables not only for my own consumption, but also to trade with the neighbors for other items: fresh eggs, homemade bread, milk. The fruit trees began to bear their first fruits, and I learned to make jams and preserves with Mrs. Miller. I bought some hens for fresh eggs and a dog, a caramel-colored mutt who showed up on the road one day and decided my yard would be his new home. I named him Ginger because he would jump with joy whenever he saw me coming with his food. One morning, I had an unexpected visitor. It was Martha, accompanied by an elderly woman I didn't recognize at first. "Eleanor, this is Clara," Martha introduced. "She runs the shelter for battered women." Only then did I remember. I had donated a considerable portion of the money from the house sale to that institution without revealing my identity. Clara took my hands in hers. "I came personally to thank you. Your donation allowed us to fix the leaking roof and buy new beds for the children." A lump formed in my throat. "You don't have to thank me. I just hope it helps other women find the strength that took me so long to find. You are an example for all of us," Clara said with teary eyes. "Martha told me your story. What you did takes a courage that few have. I didn't consider myself brave. I had only done what was necessary to survive. But seeing the gratitude in that woman's eyes, I realized that my story could mean something to other people besides myself." That same day, after the visitors left, I sat down at my kitchen table and started writing. Not a simple entry in my diary, but the beginning of a book. My story told not with rage or bitterness, but as a testimony that it's never too late to start over, to demand respect, to find peace. I wrote every night for weeks, the words flowing like the stream that ran through my property, sometimes calm, sometimes turbulent, but always moving forward. I wrote about the blows, about the investigation, about the sale of the house, about my rebirth in the cottage. I wrote without reservation, putting on paper pains I had never shared with anyone. When I finished the manuscript, I sent it to Martha, who showed it to a friend who worked at a small publishing house. To my surprise, they were interested in publishing it. "Your story can help other women find their own strength," the editor said over the phone. "Especially older women who believe they are trapped in abusive situations." The launch of the book, Starting Over at 60, took place at a small bookstore 6 months later. I was nervous, unsure if I had done the right thing by exposing my life so openly. What if David read it? What if he tried to stop me? But when I saw the room full of women, some young, some middle-aged, many older like me, I realized that my story no longer belonged only to me. It was a beacon for others who were still lost in the darkness that I knew so well. "How did you find the courage?" a woman asked during the signing session, her trembling hands holding my book. I thought for a moment before answering. It wasn't courage I found first. It was dignity. The courage came later when I realized I deserved more than I was getting. She nodded with tears in her eyes and whispered a thank you that carried the weight of decades of silence. At the end of the event, when the bookstore was almost empty, I noticed a man standing near the door. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized David, thinner, older, watching me from a distance with an expression I couldn't decipher. Our eyes met across the almost empty bookstore. David didn't come closer. He just stood there, frozen like a statue near the door. I felt my body tense, instinctively preparing for a confrontation. Martha, who was by my side organizing the unsold books, sensed my tension. "Is that him?" she whispered, following my gaze. I nodded slightly, unable to look away from the man I had once called son. He looked different, not just thinner, but somehow diminished, as if he had shrunk inside his own clothes. The air of arrogance that always accompanied him had disappeared. "Do you want me to ask him to leave?" Martha offered, her tone protective. "No," I replied, surprised by my own calm. "It's okay." I got up and walked slowly toward him, feeling strangely powerful in my new dress, a gift I had bought for myself with the first advance from the book. David remained motionless, his eyes registering my every step as if he were seeing a ghost. I stopped a few feet away from him, keeping a safe distance. Not out of fear, I realized, but by choice, out of respect for my own boundaries. "Hello, David," I said simply. He swallowed, his eyes scanning my face, my posture, as if trying to reconcile the confident woman in front of him with the submissive mother he had known. You're different, he finally commented, his voice low and uncertain. I confirmed. There was no need to explain more. He was holding a copy of my book. I noticed the edges were already slightly bent, as if it had been read several times. I came to give you this, he said, extending a white envelope. It's not much, but it's what I can afford right now. I looked at the envelope without taking it. What is it? Money, he replied, still holding out the envelope. I started saving after I read your book, a little each month to pay you back for the house. The surprise momentarily left me speechless. Of all the things I imagined David might want, that one had never crossed my mind. I don't need your money, I finally replied. I know, he said, lowering his hand with the envelope. But I need to pay you back, please. There was something in his voice, not manipulation or self-pity, but a genuine need. I realized it wasn't about the money itself. It was about recognition, about taking responsibility. What do you really want, David? I asked directly. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back at me, his eyes surprisingly clear. I want to say that I read your book 3 times. I want to say that you were right to do what you did. I want to say that I'm sorry, not for having lost the house, but for what I did to you, for the blows, for the humiliation. He paused, taking a deep breath. And I want to say that I understand if you never forgive me. I hadn't prepared for this. I had imagined David furious, threatening, maybe even vengeful or pathetic, begging for financial help. But not this sober, thoughtful version that seemed to have truly understood the weight of his actions. Where are you living now? I asked, changing the subject while I processed his words. I rented a small apartment near work, he replied. Nothing special, but it's what I can afford, and Sarah. A sad smile appeared on his face. She left when she realized there was no longer a big house or a comfortable bank account. It was the best thing that could have happened. Really, we fell silent for a moment. Martha kept her distance, but I could feel her attentive gaze, ready to intervene if necessary. Your book, David continued, lifting the copy slightly. It's powerful. It hurt to read. It hurt a lot, but I needed to. I had never seen things from your side before. Most abusers don't, I replied, surprised by the analytical coldness in my voice. It wasn't cruelty, just an observation. I know I don't deserve anything from you, he said, his voice failing. I just wanted you to know that I'm trying to be a better person. I'm going to a support group for men with a history of violence. I'm learning. I looked at him. I really looked at him. Beyond the familiar figure of my son, beyond the good and bad memories, I saw only a middle-aged man trying to rebuild himself from the wreckage of his own mistakes. Not so different from what I myself had done. I'm glad you're seeking help, I said sincerely. It's the first step. He nodded, still holding the envelope. I still want you to accept this. Not for you, but for me. I need to start mending what I did in some way. I thought for a moment and had an idea. There's a shelter for battered women in the city. It's called House of New Beginnings. Make your donation there. His eyes widened slightly in understanding. That's the place where you donated some of the money from the house, right? It's in the book. I nodded. They need it more than I do. He put the envelope in his pocket, accepting my suggestion. I'll do that first thing tomorrow. Another silence, less tense this time. Your cottage seems like a beautiful place, he commented, referring to the descriptions in the book. You seem happy there. I confirmed. I found my place. I'd like to, he began, hesitating. No, forget it. What, nothing? I don't have the right to ask for anything. I understood what he wanted to say, even without him finishing the sentence. He wanted to visit me, to see where I lived, maybe try to rebuild some kind of relationship. But he was right. It was too soon. Maybe it always would be. I have to go, he said finally, sensing my silence. I just wanted to see you and tell you this personally. Your book is going to help a lot of people. You're stronger than I ever imagined. It was the most sincere thing David had ever said to me in his entire adult life. Not a manipulation or a flattery to get something in return. Just a simple truth offered without expectations. Thanks for coming, I replied, surprising us both. And good luck with your recovery. He nodded, a barely perceptible movement, and then turned to leave. At the door, he stopped and looked back one last time. Mom, Eleanor, I'm truly sorry. And then he was gone, leaving only the sound of the bookstore's door chime tinkling softly behind him. Martha came over immediately. Are you okay? What did he want? I took a deep breath, feeling a strange mix of emotions I couldn't name. It wasn't forgiveness. It was too soon for that. It wasn't reconciliation. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. It was something more subtle, more complex. He wanted to acknowledge what he did. I finally replied. And I think he also needed to see that I'm okay, and are you? Martha asked, searching my face for signs of disturbance. I thought about my current life. The peaceful cottage with the murmuring stream. The hens happily scratching in the yard. Ginger who greeted me every morning with boundless enthusiasm. The shared meals with the neighbors. The quiet nights writing by the light of a table lamp. I'm better than I've ever been, I answered honestly. That night, back at the cottage, I sat on the balcony with a cup of tea and watched the stars. Ginger was sleeping at my feet, snoring softly. The meeting with David had stirred up feelings I thought I had buried, but not in the way I feared. I realized that I didn't hate my son. I didn't love him like I used to either. That love had been burned along with my dignity that fateful night. What I felt was something closer to distant compassion. The kind of feeling you have for a stranger trying to fix their life after a big mistake. I took my notebook and started writing. Not for a new book, but for myself. I wrote about the encounter, about the words we exchanged, about the diminished man David had become. I wrote about the strange sense of closure that conversation had brought. When I finished, I closed the notebook and breathed in the pure night air. The scent of jasmine blooming near the balcony filled my lungs. I was at peace, not because of David's repentance, but in spite of it. My happiness no longer depended on his approval, his love, or his recognition. It was entirely my own. Spring came to the cottage with an explosion of colours and scents. The plum tree near the house was filled with bright, dark berries. The apple trees were filled with fragrant white blossoms, and the vegetable garden was thriving with lush greens. I woke up every day to the sound of birds singing and fell asleep to the croaking of frogs by the stream. My book had gained unexpected attention. I started receiving letters from readers, mostly older women, who, like me, had endured abuse for years, convinced that it was too late to change. Some wrote that my story had given them the courage to leave toxic relationships. Others had confronted adult children who mistreated them. Each letter filled me with an emotion I had never experienced before, a sense of a greater purpose that transcended my own journey. One morning, I received a call from Clara, the director of the women's shelter. Eleanor, we have a delicate situation here. A 72-year-old woman arrived yesterday after running away from her son who was keeping her practically under house arrest. She's very frail and scared. She read your book and insists on talking to you. I know it's a lot to ask, but I'll be there today, I replied without hesitation. I asked for a ride from Mr. Miller, who was going to the town that afternoon. The shelter was in a renovated old mansion with a welcoming garden at the entrance. Clara met me at the door with a hug. She's in the back room, she explained as she guided me through the hallways. Her name is Beatrice. She was a teacher before she retired. Her son took complete control of her pension and isolated her from all her friends. She escaped when he went to work. We stopped in front of a simple door painted a soft yellow. Clara knocked lightly. Miss Beatrice, Eleanor is here to see you. I entered the modest but comfortable room alone. Sitting in an armchair near the window was a small, frail woman with carefully styled white hair. Her bony hands held my book, the pages visibly worn from so many readings. When she saw me, her eyes lit up. "Is that really you, the author?" I smiled, sitting in the chair beside her. "It's me. Clara told me you wanted to meet me." She took my hands with surprising strength. "Your book saved my life, you know." I would read it in secret when Robert was out. Each page gave me a little more courage. I felt my eyes water as she told me her story, the small abuses that escalated over the years. The way her son controlled every aspect of her life, from the clothes she wore to what she ate, the growing isolation, the constant fear. When I read about how you sold the house and rebuilt your life, I thought, if she could do it at 60, I can do it at 72. Beatrice said, her eyes shining with newfound determination. "Yesterday, I finally got the courage. I only took my documents and a change of clothes. I walked for blocks until I found a taxi. The driver brought me straight here. You were very brave," I said sincerely. She shook her head. "Not as much as you. I just ran away. You confronted. You made him pay for what he did. Each of us finds our own path to freedom," I replied. "The important thing is to take the first step." We spent the afternoon talking. Beatrice had been a literature teacher for 40 years before her son convinced her to sell her house and live with him after her husband's death. What started as a seemingly normal arrangement soon turned into absolute control. "The money from the sale of my house disappeared," she said. "Robert said he was investing for me, but I never saw a dime. When I started to question him, he got aggressive. First, it was just yelling, then pushing until one day he locked me in the room for calling a former co-worker. It was a story I knew all too well, not just from my own experience, but from the dozens of letters I had received since the book's publication. The pattern was always the same: isolation, financial control, intimidation, violence. "What are you going to do now?" I asked. A determined smile appeared on her wrinkled face. "I'm going to sue Robert to get my money back. Clara already put me in touch with a lawyer who works pro bono for the shelter. And after that, well, I've always wanted to live by the sea, maybe in a small coastal town." Before I left, I promised to visit her again and keep in touch. I gave her my phone number and the address of the cottage, saying she would be welcome whenever she was ready for a visit. "You gave me more than a book," she said as she said goodbye. "You gave me a future." On the way back to the cottage, sitting in Mr. Miller's car, I was silent, reflecting on the meeting. I had entered Beatrice's life through the pages of a book, and somehow that had changed the course of her existence. It was a responsibility I had never imagined. "Everything okay, Miss Eleanor?" Mr. Miller asked, noticing my silence. "Yes," I replied, looking out the window at the mountains that were getting closer, announcing the proximity of home. Just thinking about how life comes full circle, the visits to the shelter became regular. Once a month, I would go to the city to talk with the women who sought refuge there. Not just Beatrice, but others who arrived with equally painful stories. I didn't consider myself a counselor or a therapist, just someone who could say, "I understand," and truly mean it. In time, Clara suggested that I formalize these visits as a support group. "Women open up to you in a different way," she explained. "You represent a real possibility of starting over, especially for the older ones." That's how Starting Together was born. A group that met every 2 weeks at the shelter. There, women of all ages shared their stories, their fears, their small victories. I just moderated, offering my own experience while it seemed helpful. In one of those meetings, a young woman in her 20s asked a question that caught me off guard. "Miss Eleanor, did you forgive your son?" The room fell silent. It was a question they all wanted to ask, but no one had had the courage. I thought about the encounter with David at the bookstore, about the letters he had sent afterward, respectful letters without demands, just updates on his life and his progress in therapy. Letters that I read but rarely answered. I don't know if forgiveness is the right word, I replied honestly. I understand that he is trying to change. I accept his apologies as genuine. But some breaks are permanent. What we had no longer exists, and will never exist in the same way. But do you still consider him your son? The young woman insisted. I took a deep breath. David will always be my son biologically. But our relationship, if we ever have one again, will be completely different, based on mutual respect and clear boundaries, not on family obligations or automatic forgiveness. And is that enough for you? I looked out the window toward the shelter garden, where some children were playing, sons and daughters of women who had found the courage to break cycles of violence. It's more than enough, I replied, because my happiness no longer depends on him. It only depends on me. On the way back to the cottage that day, I stopped in the central square of the small town to buy some fruit. As I was choosing some apples, I heard someone call my name. It was Arthur, my old lawyer friend, who was passing through the area. "Eleanor, so good to see you," he exclaimed, approaching with a genuine smile. "You're radiant." We chatted for a few minutes, catching up on our lives. Arthur had fully retired and was now dedicated to painting, a hobby from his youth that he had abandoned for his legal career. "I spoke with David last week," he commented casually. "He called to thank me for the advice I gave him when he wanted to sue you. He said it was the best thing I ever did for him, stopping him from making another mistake." I nodded, not quite knowing what to say. It was strange to hear news of my son through a third party, as if he were just a distant acquaintance. "He's really trying, Eleanor," Arthur continued. "I'm not defending what he did. I never would. I just thought you'd want to know. Thanks for telling me," I replied sincerely. "I hope he finds his way." As I drove back to the cottage, I thought about that strange web of connections that life weaves. David, who had been the center of my universe for so long, was now a peripheral figure, and I, who had lived in the shadows for decades, was now at the center of a community of women who found strength in each other. The second anniversary of my move to the cottage came with the scent of apple blossoms. I decided to celebrate with a Sunday lunch, inviting the people who had become important in my new life: Martha, the Millers, Clara, some women from the support group who had already moved on, including Beatrice, who now lived in a small apartment by the sea. As she had dreamed, Sunday morning dawned perfectly. Blue sky, pleasant temperature, a light breeze rustling the leaves of the trees. I woke up early to prepare the house and cook. I had planned a simple but cozy menu: rice, beans, a ranch hennin sauce with potatoes from my garden, fresh leaf salad, and for dessert, a corn cake with a topping that my mother used to make. As I cooked, Ginger dozed lazily near the stove, occasionally opening one eye to check if any food would accidentally fall for him. The house was spotless, not luxurious, but cozy and genuinely mine. On the walls, I had framed some watercolors that I had started painting in recent months, encouraged by Martha. They weren't masterpieces, but they captured the simple beauty of my little paradise: the stream, the trees, the sunrise viewed from the balcony. The guests started arriving around noon. Martha was the first, bringing a lemon pie as her contribution. The Millers came right after with a bottle of the special lavender honey they produced. Clara arrived with 2 women from the shelter whom I didn't know yet, introducing them with affection. Beatrice appeared accompanied by a childhood friend she had reconnected with after decades of forced separation. We set up a large table on the balcony, covering it with a colourful embroidered tablecloth I had bought at the town market. Conversations flowed naturally. Laughter echoed across the property, and stories were shared without hurry. I watched that diverse group gathered in my house, people I hadn't even known 2 years ago, but who were now an integral part of my daily life. After lunch, as we were serving coffee, I heard the sound of a car approaching on the dirt road. I wasn't expecting anyone else. All the guests exchanged curious glances. "Are you expecting someone else, Eleanor?" Martha asked. No, I replied, getting up to see who it was. My heart raced when I recognized the car parking under the shade of an apple tree. It was David, alone. A tense silence fell over the table. Martha came over to me protectively. Do you want me to ask him to leave? She whispered. I looked at my guests, people who knew my story, who knew who David was and what he had done. Some looked worried, others curious. Beatrice had a particularly tense expression, perhaps reliving her own traumas. No, I finally replied. I'm going to talk to him. I walked to the car with firm steps. David got out hesitantly, wearing a simple shirt and jeans. He looked nervous, holding a small package in his hands. Sorry to show up without calling, he said when I got closer. I called several times, but nobody answered. We're having lunch, I explained, indicating the table on the balcony with a gesture. It's the 2-year anniversary of my move here. He looked at the guests who made no effort to pretend they weren't watching our interaction. I didn't know you had company. Can I come back another day? I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say yes, to come back another day, or better yet, to never come back. But another part, a part that surprised me, wanted to close this chapter once and for all. What do you want, David? I asked directly. He extended the small package. I brought you this. It's your 62nd birthday next week. I didn't want to let it go by unnoticed. I was surprised that he remembered the date. In the last few years living in his house, my birthday rarely received more than a hastily mumbled happy birthday. May I? He asked, indicating the package. I nodded, taking it carefully. It was light, wrapped in simple paper with a discreet ribbon. Thank you. An awkward silence settled between us. David looked at his feet, then at the house, the land, anywhere but my eyes. Your cottage is beautiful, he finally commented. Exactly as you described it in the book. It's my home now, I replied. He nodded. You seem well, happy. I am, I confirmed. More silence. Behind me, I could feel the attentive gazes of my guests, especially Martha, always protective. David, I have company, I said gently but with firmness. Why don't you tell me what really brought you here? He took a deep breath, finally meeting my gaze. I'm moving to another state. I got a job there. I'm leaving next week. The news caught me off guard. Oh, is that good for you? I think so, he replied. It's a new beginning, far from the memories, from the people who knew the man I used to be. He paused, swallowing. I needed to see you before I left to tell you personally that I'm still sorry. That your book changed my life as much as it did yours, that I understand now what I did. Even though it took me too long, his words were sincere. I realized there was no manipulation or self-pity in them, just the raw simplicity of truth. I hope you find what you're looking for there, I replied honestly. David looked at the balcony where my friends were trying to hide their attentive observation. You built a beautiful life here. New people, a new purpose, he said with a sad smile. I'm happy for you, really. At that moment, I felt something change inside me. It wasn't forgiveness. Some wounds are too deep to heal completely. It was more like letting go of a burden I didn't even know I was still carrying. David no longer had power over my happiness or my peace. He was just a person from my past who was following his path just as I had followed mine. Thanks for coming to say goodbye, I said. And good luck, he nodded, seeming to understand that this was the closure we both needed. No emotional hugs, no promises of reconciliation, just a mutual and respectful acknowledgement of our separate paths. Goodbye, Eleanor, he said, using my name instead of Mom, a small gesture that showed understanding of the new boundaries. Goodbye. David, he got in the car and slowly drove away down the dirt road, kicking up a small cloud of dust behind him. I stood there watching until the vehicle disappeared around the bend. The small gift was still in my hands. When I returned to the balcony, everyone was looking at me with expressions that varied from concern to curiosity. Martha was the first to speak. Are you okay? Surprisingly, I replied. Better than I imagined was possible. Yes, I am, I said, resuming my place at the table. He came to say goodbye. He's moving south, and is that the end? Beatrice asked softly, her wise eyes reading more than my words. I thought for a moment before answering. I think it's an appropriate end. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just enough. There were understanding nods around the table. Many of those people had experienced their own closures, some complete, others partial, all necessary to move forward. What did he bring you? Martha asked, indicating the package I had placed on the table. I don't know, I replied, beginning to carefully undo the wrapping. Inside was a small carved wooden box, simple but pretty. When I opened it, I found a delicate gold wristwatch that I recognized immediately. It had belonged to my grandmother, then my mother, and finally me. I thought it had been lost during the hasty move from David's house. I found it among the things that were left behind, read the small note next to the watch. I know how much it means to you. I'm sorry for everything. I touched the watch gently, feeling its familiar cold texture against my fingers. It was more than an object. It was a piece of my history, a connection to the strong women who came before me. Women whose lives I never knew completely, whose struggles probably resembled mine in ways I would never know. It was my grandmother's, I explained to the guests. I thought I had lost it forever. How nice that it came back to you, Mrs. Miller commented gently. I put the watch on my wrist where it belonged. In a way, it was symbolic. The time that had been interrupted was now flowing again, marking not just hours and minutes, but also the continuity of life with all its imperfect breaks and repairs. The rest of the afternoon passed in a lighter atmosphere. David's unexpected visit, instead of ruining the celebration, had added a note of closure that I didn't even know I needed. The conversation started flowing again. The laughter returned, and when the sun began to set, coloring the sky in shades of orange and pink, I felt a completeness that I couldn't explain. After the last guest left, I sat alone on the balcony with Ginger sleeping at my feet. My grandmother's watch shone softly in the light of the lantern, marking time with its constant and comforting tick-tock. Thinking about the 2 years that had passed, I realized how far I had come since that terrible night at David's house. The woman who trembled under her son's blows, who cried at her daughter-in-law's malicious laughter, who accepted humiliation in silence, she had transformed into someone I barely recognized. Not because this new version of me was a stranger, but because it was who I should have always been. At 62 years old, I had rebuilt not just a life, but an identity. An identity based not on sacrifices or family obligations, but on conscious choices and healthy boundaries. I had discovered that it's never too late to say no to disrespect, no to violence, no to relationships that diminish instead of elevate. And maybe most importantly, I had discovered that it's never too late to say yes to myself. The sun disappeared completely on the horizon, leaving only one last halo of golden light. I got up, called Ginger, and went inside the house I had truly made my own. Tomorrow would be another day in my new life. A life that I had conquered not only by surviving the blows, but by finding the courage to respond to them. Not with more violence, but with a cold and precise determination that changed everything. As I got ready for bed, I thought about the words "new beginning," the title of my book, the theme of the support group, the essence of my journey. Starting over didn't mean erasing the past or pretending the wounds never existed. It meant building something new and better on the scars, using them as a foundation instead of allowing them to be prisons. David was starting over in another state. Beatrice was starting over by the sea. Other women were starting over at the shelter, in small city apartments, in the new relationships they were building. And me, I had started over here, among apple and plum trees, with a caramel dog and a murmuring stream, surrounded by people who saw me for who I was. Not for what they could get from me. Time had taught me that revenge doesn't need to be loud or violent to be effective. Sometimes the best response to cruelty is simply to refuse to be diminished by it. To build a life so full and joyful that those who tried to break us become irrelevant, not out of hatred, but out of growth. This was my truth at 62 years old. That life can flourish more beautifully after a devastating storm. That the strongest roots often grow in soil that was completely turned over. That it is never, ever too late to say, this life is mine, and for any woman listening to my story. Whether she's young or old, trapped in abusive relationships, or just beginning to identify the warning signs, my message is clear. You deserve respect. You deserve peace. You deserve a life that is truly yours. And if I, at 60 years old, could find the courage to start over after decades of submission, you can too. It doesn't matter your age, your financial situation, your fears. The first step is the hardest, but each step after it becomes a little easier until one day you find yourself walking. No, dancing toward a freedom you didn't even know existed. Now, if you liked this story, click subscribe to Grandma's True Moments and tell me in the comments what part left you speechless. Oh, and don't forget to become a member.